Well, good morning, everybody. We've got another chance to open up the text of First Corinthians. We're going to be in chapter 9 today. Michael Walls and Terry Francis are along with myself. How you guys doing today? Terry, you doing all right?
I'm good, man. How are you guys doing?
Doing
I'm
well.
doing super. Doing
Michael's doing,
super.
looks like he's doing good too. Each of you have new locations. It's like you're moving around in the same box, trying
This
to
is not
find new
true. This is
connections.
actually my old location, and Michael was in that location last week.
Everybody, we've got another chance to open up the text of First Corinthians.
Whoops.
Accurate, but and yet there's a lot of shifting around. I think you guys are both getting a little stir crazy. You might want to work on that a little bit.
Harry, you are sitting in like different spots in the same room sometimes. It seems
Yeah,
like.
well, it's tempting because sometimes I really like to get the old sign from out front. I think it's just cool. And then sometimes I want to prove I have books because Phil thinks I can't read. So I kind of rotate around through those.
There's
There's also
ability
different.
and willingness. Ability and willingness.
There's different chairs too, and that plays into this. Which chair am I feeling? Do I want to lean back in the old easy chair, or do I want to sit up in the office chair? So today we're sitting up in the office chair,
Okay.
Oh, good.
and
Okay.
I'm sitting here and ready to go, and
All right, let's get
we'll have
going.
a great time.
Chapter 9.
Chapter 9. We've got a little bit of backstory. Just a reminder, we've talked about the time frame. We're looking around 55 to 59 AD for the writing of the letter. We're talking about the longer opening of the relationship between the Apostle Paul and the brethren at Corinth. Chloe's people, Apollos, a number of others, Silvanus and Timothy, they all make appearances in the text itself. But let's go ahead and dig in. Michael, why don't you read for us right now, at least, maybe verses 1 through 7.
All right. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk?
So there we go. We've got there's a bit of a shift in style and content to a certain degree from the end of chapter 8 to the beginning of chapter 9 on one level, because he starts talking about some different things. And yet, particularly, at least on the first layer of things, verse 13 ends in chapter 8. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat, lest I make my brother stumble. Am I not free? Is the kind of the follow-on in the English translation. So what is Paul doing here? Like, why does he shift tone and direction? Was he trying to get us to know and to understand? What do each of you see in these introductory verses in the text? Maybe even just starting at verses 1 through 3, even though we've got the larger text block at play.
Well, I mean, it feels like there's some other questions there. He doesn't always say, we're answering this question that you gave us earlier. He does that sometimes, but it feels like there's probably some other issues here, because he spends all the way down to verse 12 rather, sort of defending himself a little bit from something. And I think maybe it's connected back to the I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Peter stuff in chapter 1, but and maybe he put it down and he came back to it, I mean, that could account for it. Maybe this is something that bothers him, so the style is going to change. I think those are all human pieces to this as he's writing these things, and clearly here I feel like he's a little bit frustrated with some of the nonsense that they're throwing at him.
Well,
Yeah.
I think it's certainly odd, right? It feels weird. That's what the word Michael used for it earlier is weird. I think one of the things that's really weird is it just doesn't sound like what we've been reading, right? I mean, that's one of the things too, is like even the style sounds odd and disconnected. And yet I kind of see a connection. I mean, I think, I don't know so much that I see this as a defense, but I think he's really setting up this idea of sacrificing for others and giving up liberties for others. And I think what he's doing is I think we see it as a defense, but I think what he's doing more than anything else is just saying, this is what I do, is I sacrifice myself for others, which ties back to, by the way, that idea in chapter 8 of not being a stumbling block to the person who thinks that you can't eat meat from because it may be from the temple. And I guess that's how I see this, is more this kind of continuation with him being a personal example, kind of as a transition to where he gets at the end of the chapter at the end of chapter 9 about disciplining yourself, which I think incorporates all that idea together. It's kind of how I see that going together. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just that's how I feel. Although it is weird and odd, I'll admit that.
I think you're right. I mean, he definitely comes back to that idea as you're talking about the end of the chapter. And I think most of us preachers always go to this middle part because we, this is how we get paid, maybe, right? There's always that issue, right?
We're using it to defend ourselves.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't mean Paul did.
Yeah, preachers kind of know this one, but most everyone else knows the end of this chapter and maybe not so much the beginning, because it's odd.
Yeah.
So I'll kind of approach it from my standard perspective. I think chapter 9 break really is off-putting for the weirdness of the text. Because if you include verse 13 as the start point, then verse 1 of chapter 9 is basically the explanation of that. And so then it doesn't have the where does it belong. It's like, oh, he's explaining himself right here. Second layer I see here is also from a language standpoint. Sometimes when we go from Greek, Hebrew, French, Spanish, or whatever into English, everything gets weird. The easiest illustration of that is try to put together a project with a set of instructions that are from another country. And they're translated 4 times before they get to English. And so there's a little bit of that, even with the high level of expertise in a typical biblical translation, and a lot of expertise that goes into that process. But I think it really is an explanation of his attitude in verse 13, this sense of selflessness. He was free, even though he recognized he chose to curtail those liberties and to bring himself back into check. It parallels to me at least, the instruction he gives in the text of Romans, the attitude you see present in the text of Galatians, this willing to sacrifice himself, the general tenor and tone of him seeing himself as one who is pouring himself out as a drink offering. So I think those are some of the things that, at least on the first look at this, as to why it, on the one level, is weird, because he's shifted off of the physical relationship stuff from earlier chapter 7 and so on. But now he's starting to open up this big, huge Watergate. There's some more stuff going on there too.
But he doesn't really shift off of chapter 7. He ties chapter 7 in here. I mean, let's be honest. Hey, don't I have a right to have a believing wife? I mean, that's why I think it's kind of interesting. I mean, yeah, I get the point that when you translate stuff, this happens at times. This is just a whole nother level of oddity. I mean, I don't know that this is quite, and that's the hard part of this. I mean, it doesn't feel the same way as other parts, and we have the same translation issues, I think, in other parts. It's just one of those deals where, and I do think that I think one of the problems here is we're bound by these chapter and verse divisions. I think if you pulled out my reader version over here without all that this would make a lot more sense. I think this is one of those places where that causes us huge issues by segmenting this into these blocks without really thinking about how this fits together.
I think you're right. But, when I read this first couple of paragraphs, I'm like, is Paul really being treated different? Because I get that feeling that he's really being treated different. And the main reason I can think for that is because he's not one of the original 12, right? And there's other places where he has to defend himself a little bit. And you're right, even though he's not married, I don't know what Barnabas' status was, but it feels like he just kind of stepped back for a minute and said, now hold on a minute. Here's a personal application of what we've been talking about, or what I've been writing about, of all these things. And again, all the way through this chapter, it's I don't want to say it's about him, but he's using himself as the example.
Well, he's definitely an outsider, and he's a weird, utilized outsider. about as traditionally upper crust leadership Israel as you can find. And God uses him to the Gentiles. And so he's an outsider that could have been an insider, that's now like a really further outsider. And then he chooses, or for whatever unknown factors, we never see him as being married in the New Testament. And his experience and life and background then manifests itself that way through all these things. Even in the conflicts, he's the outsider. Peter, Barnabas, fought back up into Judaism models, first century Judaism models, and then Paul's on the outside there. An illustration, a way to think about this is a kind of conflict that exists between Christians who choose to go to whatever college. Terry and I both went to Florida College and to Western Kentucky, so we have shared memories there. And if we meet someone who did those two things, instantly we're in the in crowd. But if I talk to someone who only went to Texas A&M, great university, great education, I don't know anything about that experience, and they don't know anything about my experience. And so they can be seen as separate parties almost. I think Michael went to a couple of schools like SFA and De Anza. That the two schools, at least two of the three.
Sam Houston State.
Sam Houston. Sam Houston.
In fact, Sam Houston State.
He's got the Bears on. That's right. Is it Bears? Is that right?
Bearcats.
Bearcats.
It's a real thing.
Real thing. So all of that kind of creates these corners of conflict. And I think Paul is definitely part of that. I think he really is at some level pushed out from the in crowd at times. And we see that in the text. And it defines some of this.
Doesn't that seem weird to us? That Paul is an outsider and will be considered an outsider, even though later he says, like, I did all this stuff. I'm fascinated by how he just kind of throws out, the stuff about the other apostles and Jesus' brothers and so on. It's like, we don't know all this stuff. Yeah. He just, I think sometimes we forget in that era. I mean, they knew way more than we think they did.
Yeah. I think Tim Beckley's comment is kind of where I'm at on this, and that's what I was referencing earlier, that these questions Paul's asking rhetorically link chapters 8 and 10 with this personal appeal of how Paul applies these principles of love towards the Corinthians. He's asking them to do that in food sacrifice to idols, and that culminates with 11 verse 1, which I think most of us agree 11 verse 1 should go at the end of chapter 10. I mean, we see that as a bad division usually. The imitate me as I also imitate Christ. I mean, I think that's exactly how I kind of see that in this section. I think Paul's an outsider, but I think he's not. Like, I don't know how big of a case we can make for that. I mean, and I just think there's greater here is just this idea of, I think sometimes we try to go too many levels deep maybe. And I think this is just one of those deals where it's just like, hey, you see me do all this stuff, you do that too. Like, I think it could be that simple in this text.
So let's make some tracks into the second part of the text, verses 3 through 7 that we've already read. And what is he trying to get at with that illustration? Like, what is he trying to dig into it? And he's like, with, say, verses 6 and following. Is it only Barnabas and I who have a right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard? Like, who is he trying to defend? Who is he trying to encourage? And what's the application of it before we go the next step of things? Is there something that we can practice in here as believers for today?
Well, I think there's a part of this we still practice today, which is this idea that there's some people, because of what they do, they live by a different set of rules than everybody else, right? And let's just be real blunt about that. Like,
who would those people be, Terry?
Yeah, the preacher. We treat the preacher completely different than we even treat the elders. I mean, the whole glass houses, fishbowl, whatever analogy you want to use that is used all the time, is this idea. And look, I understand why we do that, but I also understand that there's a part of this that is very much of the idea of, hey, look, we deserve to be treated like everybody else. Like, you should not create this special class of citizenship for us just because we've dedicated our life to do this thing. And that seems to be what he's saying here. And again, I see this both as a defense, but also an example. Hey, look, I'm willingly do this, but that doesn't mean you get to expect me to do all this. I think that's really what he's saying there. Like, I'm willingly not marrying, and we know that from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, right? We know that that was a decision he made. But he's also saying at the same time in chapter 9, but I can if I want to. Like, and I think that's the idea here is, hey, look, we make a lot of decisions, but that doesn't mean we're required to make those decisions. Understand that context and why we are. And what that means is, you don't get to hold me to a decision, to a standard of those decisions. You don't get to hold me to a standard that's higher than you because I have given up liberties for what I do. And now all of a sudden you're binding that as not giving up a liberty, but a requirement. And I think that's the idea here and the application today. I'll get off my soapbox and let one of you guys to go through there.
I'll give a couple of illustrations about this. This is kind of in the text if we wanted to modernize it a little bit. I remember a television episode, Seventh Heaven. It was like a sitcom thing for a while. And there was this whole episode about this guy having to buy the right kind of car. He had to buy one that was economically, fiscal, family modeled. And like there was this big typical sitcom drama that there was a different car he was test driving for a few days. And everyone freaked out because it was a fancy sports car. And I say that because I have witnessed all of these things take place. Michael and I know a preacher who's a wonderful guy who had a convertible Miata for a while. I mean, it's a Mazda Miata. The thing needs like extra horses to go up a hill. And I have another friend who preaches, and he was driving a Corvette for a while. And the responses of those folks, I think he might still have that Corvette, were vastly different. And it talked about the context. I remember hearing the very, very plain statement. His joke was, this was another member of the congregation of the guy who had the Corvette. Look, preachers have a need for speed too. And that was a more balanced response, a little comedy in all of that. And I think it's important to see that Paul is in essence making an argument like that. That's the argument he's making.
Look, I remember one time we had a minivan. By the way, I'm a certified hater of minivans. I'll say that straight up. We had a minivan that the transmission went out. I fixed it. The transmission went out the day after I fixed it. So
must have been a Dodge.
Yeah, it was a Dodge, by the way. Very good.
I had one of those too.
Yeah. So I started looking around, right? And we bought a used Suburban, which was the off-road package. And I tell you, it was the black one. It was like one of our favorite cars. It was at the time, the Suburban that like anytime there was a TV show that there was FBI or CIA or Secret Service, that was our car, right? It was in the show. And four-wheel drive, all that kind of stuff, awesome vehicle. We got a good deal on it. So first Sunday I pull up to church in that. What do you think the first thing I get asked is? Or the first statement that gets said? Guy walks up to me and says, well, I can tell we're paying the preacher too much. He drove the exact same car except the newer model he bought new. And so I turned and looked at him and I said, you realize you drive a newer version of this and I bought an old cast off. You paid full price. And he just walked off. And like that's for me is the perfect example of that. Like it's not even a matter at that point of speed or any of that stuff. This was a necessity. I'm a family of 5. I got to have 3 rows, right? I mean, that's just where we're at. And again, different standards.
So let's do 2 things with this. And Michael, do you have anything you want to add to there? I know you know some of the folks I was referencing in the storytelling there.
I can add a story to that, but you probably want to just move on.
Yeah, okay. So think about this. This is a principle that we can see vividly in the lives of the Apostle Paul and ourselves and other preachers and shepherds and deacons that we know. They've all been put through this ringer, as well as individual members who have been blessed by their hard work to receive advanced, increased income and wages. We do this to people unfairly. Paul is trying to help people recognize that whole system of judgment and unequal treatment needs to be tossed to the side and learn to look at the brethren in Christ in a more healthy way. I think that's where he's trying to drive to. Terry, why don't you read for us a little bit, say verses 8 through 14.
Just got to point out the guy that can't read gets asked to read all the time. But anyway, 8 through
It's not
14.
about ability, it's about willingness to do so.
Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake because the plowman should plow in hope and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we've not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel.
Yeah, I think the combination of Jay's comments and Hal's comments to a certain degree, Hal's had a little tag-on story. Haters gonna hate is kind of where Paul is walked through. Like, no matter where he goes, there's a certain contingent that is either thinking it's funny or they're using their actual feelings under the cloak or veneer of comedy to tell people how they feel. They feel like it's unfair or unrighteous or sinful even. On this comment, there are instances where I've sat down and discussed the scriptures with folks that really believe that a preacher's pay should keep them humble. It's actually like you got to back that down to amount to where they are some level of being impoverished. I don't know if you guys have had those conversations, but I know I have.
In a business meeting one time, it was said that they would help my marriage by keeping me poor. And now let me say, we've all got our
Wow.
and that
Wow.
sounds bad. So let me say this though. I've been doing this, Phil. I know you and I are about the same time. You know, I've been doing this, and I guess Michael, we've never talked about how long, but you know, I'm over 20 years into this thing. This is what I've done full time. There has been a huge, tremendous shift in the way churches take care of their preachers. And while I think at times that may have been not as fast as we had hoped, I can tell you, in dealing with young guys that I help find places, and I know Phil's like this too, or dealing with my interns and where they go, that the way they start out now is far better, and even if you include inflation, than the way we typically started out. I mean, my first work, I was below the poverty line. I mean, for a fact, I wouldn't have eaten if my wife had not taught school. But now I just want to compliment, and I don't want us to be too negative. The church as a whole has done a really good job of growing their mindset in this area, I think. And today, I think it is more common to treat preachers like professionals than not, in that sense. That's been my findings. I think Phil and I have talked about that. And that's, by the way, through some education of good elderships and some older preachers than us that have done their time kind of trying to show that. So I just want to make sure nobody thinks that we're piling on too hard here in that sense.
Yeah, I'll just, one level of vulnerability openness. When we moved to Cookeville, Tennessee, we qualified for WIC food stamps with 2 small children in one of the most affordable places to live in the nation. So think that as you will. You can digest that to your own terms. I will say, by my understanding, though, the comparison to, say, Clint Springer, who is my wife's grandpa on one side, way better than what he experienced preaching in East Texas. So
yeah, guys working for chickens, right?
Yeah.
You know, the typical practice then was to use your preacher for 1 to 2 years, kick them to the curb, and find a new one, and then keep paying them as little as possible under that same model that Keith points out. I'll say a contrast to this, and this is something that I haven't really given much thought to, is to think about the growth of congregations in in the sense of how effective are they, how much do they reach in regards to how they treat one another in their leadership roles. Supported elders, supported preachers, you want to grow in congregation, maybe there's a connection there. And we'll leave that on the table for a further discussion, but I think there's some math that might support some reconsiderations of those things.
By the way, let me say this one thing. A friend of mine, and I know you know him, Phil. He's been on here with us. When he's asked, well, how much do you think this lesson is worth in a meeting or something? He always brings up somebody like, let's say a George Bush or a Bill Clinton or somebody who gets invited to these one-time speaking events. And he's like, well, this guy gets paid $50,000 to speak for 30 minutes. And he does the same thing everywhere he goes. And he said, so let me ask you this is what I deliver Sunday morning more valuable or less valuable than what he's doing for 50 grand? Now, he's not saying that to point out that we should be paid 50 grand a lesson. What he's saying there is you really can't put a price on this, right? And I think that at the end of the day, verse 14 is really the idea. The idea here is that those who proclaim the gospel should be able to live by proclaiming the gospel. Like at the end of the day, I think it's sad that any preacher would be on WIC. And I think one of the reasons I would say that, by the way, is how many of our churches would brag about, well, they would never take assistance from the government, and yet they do. They subsidize their preacher's salary with government programs. And there's some things to consider along those lines. And there's a lot of underpaid categories. My wife's a teacher. I mentioned that. Teachers are underpaid. I'm sure Michael would agree with that. And so we're not just piling on there, but there's a lot of things here to think about. And just think that your preacher should be able to live doing what he's doing. And that does mean, by the way, there may be some guys that aren't worthy of that. That's a whole nother discussion as well.
Mm-hmm. And some guys who are obviously both within the body of Christ, the potential is there, but in the broader religious world, that are overpaid. Like all that's possible. And all that's in the underlying. And Bobby brings up a great point, that there's a certain level of stereotyping that takes place. And so we just kind of work within those structures and think X, Y, and Z always apply when they really don't. And a quick comment, Tim Beckley, you saying that it's been a while since you said this statement is kind of like me not talking about the garden. Those are not really as reliable as we want them to be. I will note also that Hal mentioned that he talked about the garden as well as somebody else I know on Sunday. Maybe more than two. I don't know. I think that's the right time to include that information for all of us.
I really love how
I'm going to mute my mic now.
Turn off your mic. I really love how Paul goes to this passage in Deuteronomy. And when you read that in Deuteronomy, you go, what does that even mean? There's no context. There's no explanation. It's just dropped right in there at the end. And then I love here with Paul, like, that's for us. And you go, bam, this is high level thinking. Of course, the Holy Spirit doing this, but this is what the Old Testament's supposed to do. And when Paul's saying the Old Testament is your schoolmaster and it's profitable for all this stuff, that's the kind of thing he's even talking about. I love that.
Well, and a couple things. This is my perspective to any of the Old Testament citations that are brought in the New Testament. They don't follow the rules that we want to do. They don't use MLA format. They don't cite their sources. And while we know where this one comes from, he's alluding to an idea. He's like, look at the old law. And this is the simplified version. Oxes, they got paid. Priests, they got paid. Why are you acting like this is a weird thing? That's my approach to what he's doing there. He's even in the context in the old, like where it is, I guess, in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is an interesting text because it's kind of a compilation of all the things. It's a catalog of all the things in the way it's laid out too. So with that, he's now begun to make the foundation for his work. And I think it's important for us to understand it in the sense of what God is unfolding for the instruction to the church at Corinth, because they had created these different standards of who's important, and they have their own little conflicts of, well, I've got Peter, I've got Paul. or I've got Apollos, when they should all have Jesus. Well, where does the Peter and the Apollos and the Paul and the Barnabas, where do they all fit into that? And how does that all contextually then move forward? Like, do they listen to Paul? They should listen to Paul. Should they have paid Paul? Absolutely, 1,000%. And now they act this way. And Jay asked the question, as best as we can understand, he never took anything from them. He robbed other churches, is the terminology that he used. So it kind of is putting the thumb down on the last nail and saying, pushing it in. Here we go. This is a big thing. So
isn't this the main point of this whole chapter or this whole section in verse 12?
Yeah.
We endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel. And you guys have already hit on it, but I mean, this is where everything then shifts back to, okay, kaboom. This is the big picture here and how you need to be thinking. It's how I think and Barnabas thinks and how we act. And so now here's what it means in some specific cases again.
Yeah. And then I think we'll read up into verses 15 through 18 real quick. There it reads, but I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision, for I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I might present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. So Paul gives insight into his attitude underneath it, and he's saying basically for him, his decision to labor making tents, for his decision to engage in these things, he recognized gave him stronger leverage. In the words of a Jedi, he had the high ground. We got to have some of those illusions, Walls. We got to bring them in.
I like it.
Basically, he says he has the moral high ground. He has that picture where he says, "Look, this is all things that I could have done." And I love the way that the ESV brings out the tenor and tone of this particular text. I would rather die. Like, that's how much he lodged this desire to have it this way. Now, I think this is where we can make a side comment to Tim's point. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't that he didn't want to give up the high ground. It's that ground he was on gave him the ability to pull others up there with him. That's the way that I see the application of his attitude. What do you guys catch in the text as well?
Well, he has the ability to do that, as you guys mentioned, because he's robbing other churches, right? So, I mean, this is a Corinthian issue in particular between Paul and them, because what I'm gathering is he understands, knowing them, that this is a hot button issue. So I'm not going there because I know it would, even though I'm right to go there, if I did it because of you, because of how you are, how you're thinking, that would undermine me, as you already said. So he's able to do this because of the generosity of other congregations and other people, so that he can make this particular point here. But I love that way he puts it too. I'd rather die. And Paul's sort of that way, right? I am going to go to whatever extreme I need to go to be successful with the gospel.
Harry, you unmute yourself yet?
Okay, I'm back. Look, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is to kind of plug in. I think it's very likely that, someone like the Philippian church is supporting Paul while he's here and doing this work, and when he's in Corinth. So one of the things to point out is it's not like this was a problem everywhere. I mean, the church in Philippi, he commends them for the gifts that they brought to him. So I just think it's interesting to kind of see that. But the thing that I love here that I think needs to be pointed out is the end of verse 16. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. Like, that to me is that Jeremiah kind of time where Jeremiah said I tried to hold it in, and it was a flame that burned within me. I think one of the things to understand, and I think this is true of most preachers today. I mean, is it true there are some guys out there that are, for lack of a better term, kind of mercenaries in their approach, that this is just the way they found to make a living and they're just earning a check? I think that's possibly true. And but I got to tell you that most of the guys like Michael and Phil and my other friends that we talk on a regular basis, I mean, this is who we are. And if we had to go make tents to keep doing this, this is who we would still be, because I think that's how you guys are. I mean, woe to me if I don't preach the gospel. And I actually considered that before I moved to where I'm at now. I actually considered getting out of preaching because of just some personal issues and some things that had happened where I was at. And I didn't, because I knew that's something I couldn't do. I also know there's and Phil and I talk about this a lot. I also know there's a lot of guys that do make that decision to just leave this all behind. And I don't know that it's always because they don't have the fire. I just think sometimes they lose the desire, and partly because what we were talking about earlier and the way they're treated. But I just love that kind of burning desire of, and even this idea that, I'll die doing this, that concept. I want people to know that more than likely, and especially if your preacher is doing what you would consider to be a above average job, an excellent job, he more than likely has this burning desire inside of him that regardless of how much you paid him, regardless of what you did, regardless of how you treated him, he's still going to preach the gospel the same way, because that's just who his character is at this point. It's part of my identity, and I know it's part of Phil's, and I think it's part of Michael's too. It's become who we are. We can't stop that.
I remember, go ahead,
Michael. People may not realize most of those guys you're talking about, pretty well educated. They could all be doing something else and probably make a whole lot more money, from that standpoint. To kind of tie it back into all this discussion, they could, and they willingly choose not to, and do other things, make tents, whatever the case. I teach college, whatever we have to do to make it happen, because we have to, we need to, we want to. It's all of that. And it's hard to sort of pigeonhole any one of those things, but all of us could be somewhere else, just like the other people are.
I think
Yeah.
Warren King was the first
I don't know
one.
about you guys, but let me say, I've been recruited to secular jobs. I've had people ask me to leave preaching. And I think that's true of all three of us, because the skills we have, they translate to other jobs really well.
Yep.
But I can't do that. And I know Phil can't. I mean, we've had that conversation. We had that conversation about the same time, because we were both going through the same kind of transition. And that's one of the things that brought us together, was that just this understanding, this is who we are. It's a bond that we have.
Well, this and kind of digging into the tech side of things, I remember Warren King told me a few years back, a lot of years now, if you can keep from preaching, then don't.
Yeah, I had that same speech given to me.
Michael has heard that same exact speech, I'm sure. There was a second piece of advice that would have applied to our 1 Corinthians 7 chapter as well. That is, be careful with the women. Those are two great bits of advice that came from Warren to us. And yet, eventually, we're both preaching, and Terry's preaching, and all of that takes place. And Terry's right. It is something that is imbued into Paul. It gets imbued into us. We can see it in his attitude. First time I met Ronnie Barrett, he had watched me for about 30 minutes, walked up to me and said, "Where do you preach?" He just instantly recognized that from his own personal context and what he had experienced. And so folks see those things. And you could see that in Paul. You could see it in his demeanor. He had this attitude of service. And we get back into the text and away from the personal application side. And you start thinking about the struggles that Paul is trying to use to teach these brethren to be better. Because that's what he's using, is taking the wisdom that he's gained. Now, how can you be made better by it? And that's where verse 19 comes in. Jay talks about, by the way, like how a lot of young guys move into this appointment context because there's more certainty to it, because it's going to be okay if it doesn't work out. And that's true. You kind of ease yourself that way as well. I did that. I preached a lot of places by appointment for a long time before I was preaching on a regular basis, however you want to categorize it. But verse 19 introduces the next idea for us, and it says, "For though I am free from all," we want to try to get this whole chunk in there. So let's quickly read the whole rest of the chapter. I think there's a lot of it that sums up here. We're going to go a little longer than normal. We'll probably get down to about 55 minutes for the whole thing this time, but it is what it is. So Terry, why don't you read verses 19 through 23, and Michael can follow along right after that to close out the chapter. So we'll do 19 to 27 in a block.
For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessing.
Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified.
All right, though, verses 19 through 23, we kind of broke that textual block off first. What do we see in here? What is he trying to help us understand on the 21st century, first century application side?
My soapbox is flexibility. You know, I could jump on it. This is what I've tried to instill in my children in terms of their career path, their college education, whatever they're doing, that they learn different things. They're able to do and willing to do different things. They don't just sort of lock themselves in, but culturally, that's really what Paul's getting at here, right? I'm going to do what I have to do. He's already established that. So when it comes to being a Jew or a non-Jew or whatever, I don't care about that stuff anymore. As long as I'm, of course, still following Christ. But I don't care about all that cultural stuff. I don't care about that difference between Jew and Gentile. I think that's a big one we don't understand. That's huge for someone to step out of that box and then just give it up. And he would do that. And we would see him come back to it when he would go to Jerusalem. But he was easily able to slip in and out of that. That's flexibility.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to see. And you see this in Paul's life. I mean, I think about this idea of Jews became a Jew when he comes back to Jerusalem and he ends up going to the temple with those who are under the Nazirite vow. And you just see these cases where Paul puts himself in situations to connect to people from a very diverse spectrum. And I think there's an application to us today of the same need. You know, I'm a sports guy, but I got to be able to put that in a box and talk to somebody who hates sports. And I know that's like a shallow kind of deal, but I think there's a part of that is dead on here. That and what this really is talking about, I think, in this whole section is really that idea of being made a servant to all. And that's really what's tied in the section above is this idea that I serve other people. And so if in this context, I need to become this in order to serve other people, then that's who I've got to become. And if in other context, I've got to be this guy to be the effective servant to those people, then that's who I'll become in that context. And the motivation here is not Paul saying, hey, look, I'm a Jew, I'm a Roman, I can do all these things. It's more of, this is what it takes to serve other people, which goes back to chapter 8, right? This idea of, yeah, you can eat meat, you can do that. But now when you serve the person who thinks you can't, what would the decision be? And that's where you start seeing, I think, all this kind of tied up together and how it really comes together and makes sense and all the clunkiness and all the oddities. This is where you kind of have that aha moment, this last chunk, and you go, oh, so this is where he was headed, which, by the way, feels very much like Paul, doesn't it? To kind of kind of all of a sudden just poof, here's his point.
Mhm.
That's very much a Paul style thing.
Yeah, he likes to do the verbal gibbing, where he'll smack you upside the head when you're not least expecting it because you needed to have it happen. That's another pop culture reference you can dig out and see what it means to be gibbed. But in the text here, in the setting, to a certain degree, Paul is basically laying out a model of service to victory. Service that starts in his willingness to be at ease in working with those from all spectrums. Terry used the simple analogy of sports, but we could say so that working with those who are a Fortune 500 CEO to those who have just made it out of rehab, and be comfortable in presenting yourself as a servant to both. That's the real layer application that I like to see here, is that high level of either is what I need to do. And it doesn't matter whether that person who was the CEO of the 500 company was morally strong or weak before you met them, and vice versa for the person coming out of rehab. It's just, this is who they are, because they're precious in the sight of God, and I will serve them with the gospel, which leads to one of these really simple, very much like a Jesus type illustration, but much more in Paul's context. Jesus pulls his illustrations out of the Galilee region, out of Israel. Paul moves most of his illustrations out of the larger Greco-Roman world, which is his background. And so this picture of a race, of a boxing match, is totally in line with him, but also Corinth. So he's literally doing the thing that he's trying to help them become and do themselves. Look, here's something you know and see. Here it is. Let me be an example to you in this way. You guys know what this is like. And so I think I see a lot of that in the closing refrains of verses 24 through 27. This, I discipline my body and keep it under control business. And I think there's a tenor of us also seeing Paul. He had to stay in shape physically and spiritually to maintain the kind of lifestyle he was leading. If you're always on the run, you want to be able to run. Is another way to kind of think about it. And I think there's some value to all of us who preach to think about that on the spiritual level and the physical too. He wasn't distinguishing and dismissing the lower form of physical, discipline. He was using that as the stepping stone to the higher one, a spiritual one.
And look, in athletics too, one of the things to understand about this example is good athletes do everything purposeful, right? And even in the off season, I mean, I watched the Last Dance, and that's a whole nother thing. But I was watching that last night, and it was interesting that when Jordan and the Bulls lost the second time to the Pistons, Jordan had never done any off-season training, and he came to a point where he's like, "Well, we can't do this anymore." And so they started like immediately lifting weights and training in the off-season. They became more focused, and they won. Right? They turned everything around. It changed their life. And it was then where they became more purposeful in their team and in their training and all that kind of stuff. And so what you see, I think, is a good example. These successful athletes and all these examples here is that every action's purposeful. And we understand that, by the way, more probably than they did. I mean, my kid that plays soccer, there's suggestions on what to eat, what not to eat, how to train, how not to train, what works, what doesn't work. I mean, it's an inundated kind of training that is handed over. The technology has come so far. Everything has a purpose. And I just think that ties and wraps this all up. Hey, part of being a servant is realizing everything has a purpose. So you discipline yourself, and sometimes you don't do things because it's better for everybody else that you don't do those things. And that's how I see this kind of tying all that up.
Yeah. And of course, everyone understands that, whether they like sports or not, right? To use your earlier thing. But the big difference here is this isn't a game. That's a game. That's important. There might be a lot of money riding on it. Their Olympics, there was a lot of benefit to winning and so on. But this is not a game. I'm doing it, in Paul's words, to make sure that I'm not disqualified either. As he's already said, I'm doing all this for the sake of the gospel, verse 23. And I'm doing this for you, when he's talking about why I'm not taking any money in this particular case. I'm doing this, and this is not a game. This is not something you can just stop or just walk away from because it has he gets to, I think, later in the letter, far bigger consequences.
Yeah, and so let's kind of sum it up this way, and then we'll go around the horn in a second. In the first century culture that Paul is drawing from, we have the honor-shame context of a patron providing the ability for an athlete to prepare for the conquest ahead, the event. The expectation was, after being supported to do this task, he would go win. And when he won, he would bring at least two things back to his hometown: the prize money that would be shared with everybody, including the patron, but also all those who lived in that community, and the honor that went with it. And he would share that honor with his entire community. Then the expectation was that everyone who had been blessed by the sacrifice of the athlete and the sacrifice of the patron would then go and do likewise, that you would then share that grace. And so with this little segue here in verses 20 through 24 through 27, you get a good understanding of the sense of honor that was expected under the idea of grace in the first century culture that Paul is writing to. So he's basically telling them on the low that you haven't done that. Like on the other side of it, on the underside, you had all this honor and grace available to you. And you are now being shamed because you weren't sharing it. And so that's the other edge of this, that he is really digging into the fiber of their beings when they should have been supporting him and seeing the value of it and seeing the gain of it. So the reason he uses this illustration is very likely larger than just it's easy to catch, because he had, as Hal had pointed out, gone beyond shadow boxing and been punched more than once on their behalf. So around the horn, besides the reference to the De Silva book, Terry, what you got for us first? You can get to go the headways here.
Well, I want to respond to Hal's comment about if a preaching brother feels compelled to leave preaching for any reason or no reason, it is no sin. I agree with that in theory, but let me respond to it this way. I do think that brother needs to consider the parable of the talents and the application of what he's doing. I do think you can serve God without being a preacher, but I also think, let me compare it this way. I know a lot of guys who are great character, could serve as shepherds, and for whatever reason just decline that opportunity. They do not want to do that. And in some cases, the church doesn't have shepherds because of that. I don't know that is such an easy thing, should be such an easy thing for us to do and not realize that there is some application to that, bearing the talent in the sand and not using it. I have concerns about that. So my admonition, by the way, to several young men I've worked with who are no longer preaching is, that's fine, but you had better serve the kingdom in every way you can. And you better use the talents you have, even though you're not being compensated for using them and doing it full time. I don't think it's sin, but let me say, too many churches without good preachers today. And that's a whole nother episode, but that's something for us to consider about.
Walls?
I could not disagree at all with your statement. I love that. And, I think I know where both you guys are going. And isn't that the key? We all need to be serving with all of our abilities and all of our talents. And can you imagine if we were all doing that? And all of us certainly could do more, be better. I mean, I'm not saying that preachers are doing it and other people aren't. And I know you aren't either. But if we would all jump on board and do and use the talents and do what Paul wrote in Romans 12 and teach and admonish and give and all those other things in there, those 7 things, if we would just be doing that, how much better would our individual lives be, would our families be, would our congregations be, would our communities be? Because this is more than just, I can preach or teach a Bible class, right? I mean, when you look at it in the big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole lot broader landscape to pull from for all of us. And this should be encouraging the church at Corinth to do more in their relationships on the basis of seeing what Paul had invested into the relationship. So for you and I, aside from our roles as evangelists or roles as shepherds or whatever, deacons, parents, it's looking back into us and saying, on the basis of what Jesus has done for us, on the example of what Paul shows us, how can we invest in those relationships in a graceful way, a servant way, an encouraging way. Great discussion today. Great look at the text. We'll be in chapter 10 tomorrow as we continue to walk through the text of 1 Corinthians and Paul's correspondence with the brethren there. Hopefully you'll have a wonderful day today, everybody. If you've got questions, if we can encourage you in some way, we really want to be available to you. Write us a note, send us a message. We'll do our very best to answer them. But in all things, remember that Jesus is Lord and King. He is the master of the kingdom. He is the one that God has designed and planned in his big scheme of redemption to lead us into a real relationship with the divine. And it's through him we find sanctification, and he is the guarantor of our resurrection in that sense. And so if you desire to have God's blessings, and he has certainly promised us all spiritual blessings, it's going to be found in him. And in all things, may we also encourage you to know that God will bless you and desires for you to be blessed. So have a great day.